The termination letter was still sitting in the outbox of Human Resources when Brendan Kowalski walked out of St. Aubin Regional Hospital for the last time, carrying nothing except a worn canvas tote bag and a small thermos his 9-year-old daughter had painted with orange and yellow flames, because, she said, her dad always kept things warm. Behind him, the administration corridor hummed with the usual fluorescent indifference. A few nurses glanced up, a porter nodded once, nobody said anything. After 14 years maintaining every mechanical and electrical system in that building, the ventilation that kept surgical suites sterile, the backup generators that had never once failed during a Manitoba winter, the heating network that ran through 4 floors of aging infrastructure like a second nervous system. Brendan Kowalski walked out, and the hospital kept functioning as though nothing had changed at all, which, he supposed, was exactly the problem. He sat in his truck for a long time before starting the engine. The parking lot was half empty in the gray February afternoon. Snowplows had pushed dirty ridges along the perimeter, and a single crow was picking at something near the dumpsters beside the loading dock. Brendan watched it for a while. Then he looked down at his phone, where a message from Danica's school had arrived 40 minutes earlier, during the meeting where they had handed him a severance package and wished him well, letting him know that his daughter had fallen asleep during afternoon reading circle, because she had been up since 4 a.m, with a stomachache she had not mentioned to him. He had not known. He had been in a meeting learning he no longer had a job, and his daughter had been sitting at a small desk in a Winnipeg elementary school, falling asleep. And he had not known any of it. Brendan started the truck and drove to pick her up. If you've ever watched someone carry more than any one person should have to carry, and carry it quietly, without complaint, without asking for recognition, take a moment before this story ends to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Integrity Tales. Because those people deserve to be seen. Brendan had come to St. Aubin Regional the same year he got married. He and his wife, Colette, had moved from Saskatoon when she was offered a position at a law firm downtown, and he had picked up the facilities maintenance role, almost by accident, answering a posting on a community board because they needed the income while she got established. He had a technical diploma, a steady pair of hands, and a reputation among former colleagues for being the person you called when nobody else could figure out what was wrong. What started as a temporary position lasted 14 years. He became the person who understood St. Aubin better than the building understood itself. He knew which boiler ran hot on the 3rd floor and had to be manually adjusted every November. He knew that the electrical panel in Wing C had a mislabeled circuit that had confused every external contractor who had ever been brought in. He knew the exact sequence of steps to restart the oxygen delivery system after a pressure drop without triggering the full emergency protocol, because he had written that sequence himself after watching 2 technicians from an outside firm nearly cause a ward evacuation during a routine test. He kept that knowledge in a series of notebooks in his locker. He had never been asked to formalize it, never been offered the time to document it properly, and had never been promoted beyond his original classification despite taking on responsibilities that, at other facilities, would have required a team of 3. Colette used to joke that the hospital had found itself a one-man infrastructure department, and was paying him like a janitor. She said it the way you say something when you love the person and the situation frustrates you, but you are not yet ready to push them to change it. She died during Danica's 2nd year of life, from a complication nobody had caught in time, in a hospital room 2 floors above where Brendan went to work every morning. He kept going to work. What else do? You have a 1-year-old who needs to be fed in the morning and bathed at night and held when she cries, and bills that don't pause for grief, and a job that at least keeps you close to the building where your wife spent her last weeks, which is irrational, but also, for a certain kind of person, quietly necessary. He kept going to work for 7 more years. He learned to braid Danica's hair by watching the same 3-minute video on his phone every morning, until his fingers knew the pattern without needing to look. He learned which brands of instant oatmeal she would eat, and which she would push to the side of the bowl. He learned to recognize the specific silence that meant she was coming down with something, versus the silence that meant she was tired, versus the silence that meant she was thinking about her mother. He kept asking for schedule adjustment, so he could pick Danica up by 5:30. The answer was usually some version of, "We appreciate your commitment, but the facility's needs have to come first." He kept staying late anyway, because the alternative was leaving something broken, and broken things in hospitals hurt people. He kept doing this, until the morning a new hospital administrator arrived, and began a facilities review that resulted, after 3 months of consultations, with an outside firm that charged more per week than Brendan made in a year, in a recommendation to outsource the entire maintenance department. Brendan was given a folder with 2 pages of severance terms and a handshake. He cleaned out his locker, put his notebooks in the canvas tote bag, and walked out into the February afternoon. The woman who replaced the previous administrator was named Judith Renard. She had arrived at St. Aubin Regional after restructuring 2 other mid-sized regional hospitals in Ontario, and she had a reputation that preceded her the way certain weather systems do. Specific, well-documented, not entirely welcome. People who had worked with her described her in terms that split evenly between transformed the institution and left a trail. She had grown up in Quebec, studied health administration at McGill, and had spent the better part of 2 decades making organizations leaner and, she would argue, more sustainable. She was not by disposition someone who second-guessed her decisions. She had approved the outsourcing recommendation on a Thursday afternoon in January, signed off on the severance packages on a Friday, and by Monday had moved on to the next item on a restructuring list that covered 4 departments and 37 line items. 3 weeks later, St. Aubin Regional began falling apart. Not dramatically, not all at once. It happened the way things erode when the person who understood them at the deepest level is no longer there. A ventilation irregularity on the surgical floor that the new facilities contractor attributed to the unit itself, not to the relay sequence that Brendan had been manually compensating for since the previous spring. A generator test that produced a partial failure nobody could reproduce in a way that made sense, because the mislabeled panel in Wing C confused the lead technician, exactly as it had confused every external contractor before him. A pressure anomaly in the oxygen system that triggered a partial evacuation of the cardiac ward on a Tuesday evening, disrupting 3 recovery patients and sending 2 nurses home with stress injuries. The outside firm billed for each incident separately. Judith sat in her office on the 4th floor, looking at a repair log that was already longer than anything she had seen during the previous 6 months, combined. And she felt the specific discomfort of someone who is very good at identifying structural inefficiencies but has not, until this moment, considered what happens when the structure is a person. She asked her assistant to pull Brendan Kowalski's personnel file. She read it twice. 14 years, single salary tier, no promotions. Consistent performance reviews that used phrases like exceptional technical knowledge and institutional value difficult to quantify. Which was, she recognized with some discomfort, bureaucratic language for, "We know this person is worth more than we are paying them, and we have chosen not to act on that knowledge." She had not hired Brendan Kowalski. She had not fired him either, technically. She had approved a structural recommendation that eliminated the category his position belonged to. In the world of institutional restructuring, this distinction matters. In the world of a man sitting at a kitchen table at midnight, figuring out how to cover the next month's rent, it does not matter at all. Judith drove to his address on a Wednesday evening in late February, without calling ahead, because she had found over the years that calling ahead gave people time to prepare positions, and she was not looking for a negotiation. She was looking, though she would not have phrased it this way, for the truth of what she had done. The address in his file was in St. Vital, a neighborhood southeast of downtown Winnipeg. She parked on a side street beside a row of older bungalows, with snow-covered front yards, and hockey nets in driveways. The house was small, well kept in the ways that mattered, with a porch light on and a pair of small boots beside the door that were clearly a child's. She knocked. Brendan opened the door in a gray work shirt with a dish towel over one shoulder. Behind him, the kitchen was lit and warm. Danica was sitting at the table doing something with colored pencils, a plate of half-eaten toast nearby. The smell of soup was coming from the stove, He looked at Judith Renard the way you look at someone when you recognize them, from a context that does not match where you are stands. He said, "Dr. Renard." She said, "I know I should have called." He stepped back slightly, not inviting her in, not closing the door. "Danica," he said without turning, "can you take your drawing to the living room for a few minutes?" The girl gathered her pencils with the focused efficiency of a child who has learned not to ask questions when the adult tone of voice suggests, "It isn't the moment." She paused at the doorway and looked at Judith with the open, unguarded curiosity that 9-year-olds have not yet learned to suppress. "Are you my dad's boss?" she asked. Judith opened her mouth, closed it. "I was," she said. Danica considered this for a moment and then went into the living room with her pencils, and Brendan stood in the kitchen doorway and waited. Judith told him what had been happening at the hospital. She did not soften it. She described the ventilation issue, the generator failure, the oxygen system evacuation. She told him the outside firm had now billed the hospital more in 3 weeks than his annual salary. She told him she had read his file. Brendan listened without expression. Then he turned to the stove and stirred the soup, because it had started to simmer too hard, and he didn't want it to stick. "What do you want?" he said. "I'd like you to come back. I want to offer you a proper classification, a salary that reflects what you've actually been doing, and flexible hours, structured around Danica's schedule, not ours." He put the spoon down. "Dr. Renard," he said, "I've had 14 years of the hospital telling me my value was difficult to quantify. I've had my daughter fall asleep at school, because I was stuck in a meeting. I've spent a decade asking for a schedule that would let me be home before she went to sleep, and being told the facility came first." He paused. "I was picking her up on time for the first time in years when you knocked on my door. I'm not sure that's something I'm ready to give away again." Judith did not have an answer for that. She had negotiated contracts with pharmaceutical companies, had restructured departments over the objections of unions and boards, had delivered news that ended careers and redirected institutions. She was not accustomed to running out of things to say, but there was something about the kitchen, the soup, the child's drawings on the refrigerator, the specific quality of a home that has been held together by a single person's effort for years, that made her usual language feel very far away. She thanked him for his time and left. She sat in her car in the cold for a long while, before driving back. The weeks that followed were strange for both of them. Brendan had built a small freelance schedule through word of mouth. Former colleagues, a property management company in St. Boniface, a community rec center that had been struggling with its boiler system for 2 winters. He was earning enough to cover the basics. Not enough to stop watching the numbers. Danica had started sleeping through the night again for the first time in months, and on Thursdays he picked her up directly from school, and they walked to a cafe on Osborne Street that did a good hot chocolate, and stayed until the light outside turned that particular pale blue that Manitoba winter afternoons get. He was present. Genuinely present. Not the version of present that means physically in the room, while mentally calculating what still needs doing. Actually there. He noticed things he had missed. That Danica had become interested in how things worked. That she would stop at vending machines to trace the coin mechanism with her finger, or ask about the fans in the cafe ceiling, or wonder aloud why some buildings were warmer than others. He had not known she was curious in that particular direction. He had been too busy keeping the lights on everywhere else to notice. One afternoon she asked him what he used to do at the hospital, and he described it as simply as he could: the boilers, the ventilation, the generators, the way a whole building depended on systems most people never saw. She listened very carefully. "So you kept people alive?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I kept the building working," he said. "We helped the doctors and nurses keep people alive." She nodded as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. He sold his good winter coat in March to cover a shortfall in February rent. He did not tell Danica. He wore a layered system he had put together from things already in the closet, and told her it was more practical anyway. Judith Renard was not sleeping well. This was not, in itself, unusual. She had never been someone who slept easily during restructuring periods. But the sleeplessness this time had a different quality. It was not the problem-solving kind, where your mind stays active, because there are still variables to resolve. It was the other kind. The kind where you have resolved the variables, and are left looking at what the resolution cost. She had grown up watching her father run a small manufacturing company in Laval, with the conviction that sentiment was the enemy of good management. He had not been a cruel man. He had been, by his own understanding, a realistic one. He believed that the function of a business was to survive, and that survival required decisions that could not always accommodate the individual. He had passed this belief to Judith, with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness with which he had taught her to read a balance sheet. It had served her well for 20 years. She found herself, now, at the kitchen island of her apartment, a rented, well-appointed, entirely impersonal place. Looking at a copy of Brendan's performance reviews, and thinking about a kitchen, with soup on the stove, and a child's drawings on the refrigerator. She had made the decision that eliminated his position because the numbers had supported it. But the numbers had been measuring only what the outside firm had been hired to measure, and nobody had asked the outside firm to measure what one person's 14 years of institutional knowledge was actually worth. She had made an assumption about replaceability. She had been wrong, but it was more than that, and she knew it, and this was the part she was less accustomed to examining. She had read his file and seen the consistent record of undercompensation, and ignored requests for schedule accommodation, and she had recognized in that record the particular way institutions treat people who do not advocate loudly for themselves. People who believe that if they do good work, the organization will eventually notice and respond in kind. She had been part of that institution for 3 months. She had inherited its decisions. But she had also made the final one. On a Thursday in March, she went back to St. Vital without calling ahead. Brendan answered the door in the same gray shirt. Danica was at a sleepover, he said, at a school friend's house for the first time, which had cost him an hour of quietly working through her questions before she felt ready to go. He let Jude in this time. She did not bring a contract. She brought a letter, handwritten, on hospital stationery, which she had rewritten 4 times, because every previous version had read too much like a legal document, and not enough like what she actually meant. She put it on the kitchen table and stepped back. He picked it up and read it slowly. The letter described, without administrative language, what she believed had happened. That the hospital had benefited from his knowledge for 14 years, without compensating or accommodating him appropriately. That the restructuring decision had been made without adequate understanding of what would actually be lost. That she had read his file not as an administrator reviewing a staffing record, but as someone who had finally seen, too late, what the record was actually describing. She wrote that if he returned, the terms would be concrete and binding. A new classification with a salary corrected for the responsibilities he had actually been carrying. Flexible hours scheduled around Danica, formally protected and not subject to emergency override except with his consent. A role in documenting and transferring institutional knowledge, with support staff and time built in. And a formal review process every 6 months that she would personally attend. Then she had written, at the bottom of the page, in different ink from the rest, as though she had added it separately, after the official part was already done, "I know I have no standing to ask this of you. What you've already given that building is more than it gave back, but I'm asking not as an administrator trying to fix a staffing problem. I'm asking because I think I got something wrong that mattered, and I'd like the chance to get it right. That's all I can offer you." Brendan set the letter down on the table. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Outside, a car passed slowly on the icy street. The refrigerator made the small sound refrigerators make. "My daughter asked me once," he said, "whether work was more important than she was." He looked at the letter, not at Judith. "I didn't answer well. I said things like, the work matters, the patients need the building to run, which is true. But that wasn't what she was asking." Judith said nothing. "What she was asking," he said, "was whether I knew I was allowed to come home." He folded the letter along its original crease. "I'll come back," he said, "but the schedule piece isn't negotiable, not in the we'll try our best way, actually non-negotiable." "I know," Judith said, "and I'm not the person who quietly absorbs the next round of changes without saying anything. I'm done with that." "I know," she said again. He looked at her for the first time directly. "Why did you write that last part by hand?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Because the rest of it I could have drafted," she said. "The last part I had to write." Brendan returned to St. Aubin Regional on a Monday morning in early April, when the snow was finally loosening its hold on the city and the streets had gone from packed ice to that particular Winnipeg gray slush that means spring is approximately 3 weeks away, but is at least theoretically possible. He spent the first 2 weeks documenting systems, pulling the notebooks from his canvas tote bag, and working with a junior technician to build something the hospital could actually use. He was unhurried about it. Methodical. He corrected the label on the Wing C panel on the third day, and watched the lead contractor from the outside firm look at the corrected version with an expression that confirmed they had been working around that confusion for 7 weeks. He left at 4:30 every day. The first time, he half expected someone to call him back. Nobody did. He picked Danica up, and they stopped at a park along the river, where the ice was starting to pull away from the banks in slow gray sheets. She found a section of the path where meltwater had formed a shallow frozen pool, and she spent 20 minutes testing different spots with her boot, listening to the specific sound each section made, cataloging something. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Figuring out where it's thick," she said, with a focus that reminded him of himself at a workbench, and which made something in his chest do a thing he didn't have a precise word for. He let her keep testing. At the hospital, things changed more gradually than anyone expected. Judith held a department-wide meeting in which she described the outsourcing decision as a mistake, used that exact word without qualification, and outlined the corrections being made. Some people were skeptical in the way that people who have been through several cycles of institutional promises are entitled to be skeptical. Some were cautiously relieved. One longtime nurse named Paulette, who had been at St. Aubin longer than Brendan, found him in the break room that afternoon, and said, simply, "Finally." There were still difficult days. Organizations do not change because a letter was written or a good decision was made. They change slowly, inconsistently, with regressions and resistance and the occasional person who finds the changes threatening to their own position and behaves accordingly. Brendan had been around long enough to know this. He no longer confused his own good faith with the institution's stability. But something had shifted in him that was harder to name than job terms. He had spent 7 years since Colette's death, trying to earn safety through effort. Working late, absorbing requests, making himself so useful that he could not be removed. It had not protected him. The one thing that had actually changed his situation was not working harder. It was leaving. It was the moment he finally stopped and refused to give any more until something was given back. He was still learning what it felt like to believe that was allowed. Judith, for her part, was learning different things. She had dinner with Brendan and Danica 3 times over the spring, at their kitchen table, in what began as professional courtesy, and became something more honest than that. Danica showed her a diagram she had made of the cafe ceiling fans, tracking the direction they turned in winter versus summer, accompanied by a handwritten hypothesis about heat distribution that was, for a 9-year-old, surprisingly rigorous. "She explained convection to me," Judith told Brendan afterward, "correctly. She's been asking me to explain things since she was 4, he said. I think she started because she missed her mother, and it was a way to be close to me. But she actually retained all of it." Judith looked at the diagram again. What does she want to be? Brendan thought about it. Last month it was a structural engineer. The month before that, a marine biologist. 2 months before that she wanted to run a bakery that also taught people about electrical systems. He smiled. "I've stopped trying to narrow it down." Judith had grown up being told to narrow things down early. To identify the most efficient path and commit to it. The strategy had produced a career that was, by most measurable standards, successful. She was not sure, sitting in that kitchen, whether success was exactly the right word for it. It had produced results. It had not produced warmth. She was not sure warmth was something you could restructure your way into. She suspected it was more like Brendan's notebooks, accumulated. Over time, through small acts of attention, through staying present long enough to learn what a building really needed. What a person really needed. She drove home through the spring streets of Winnipeg, thinking about her father's conviction that sentiment was the enemy of good management, and wondering whether he had confused sentiment with seeing people clearly. And whether seeing people clearly was, in fact, the whole foundation of anything that lasted. She did not arrive at a conclusion. She thought she probably wouldn't, and that this was perhaps the point. In June, the hospital prototype project that had been stalled since February, a modular ventilation system for the new cardiac wing, passed its final regulatory inspection on the first submission, ahead of schedule. Brendan had identified and corrected a relay configuration issue that the contractor's team had been trying to isolate for 6 weeks. The correction took him 40 minutes. There was a small acknowledgement at the following staff meeting. Judith named him specifically, and used the word irreplaceable, and Brendan noticed the word, and let it sit there for a moment, turning it over in his mind. The distance between how that word had been used against him and how it was being used now, and what the distance measured. After the meeting, walking to his truck in the evening light, he called his sister in Saskatoon. They talked for 40 minutes, longer than they had talked in years. She asked how he was doing, actually doing, and he said he thought he was doing better. And it was the first time he had said that since Colette died, and believed it, while he was saying it. That evening, Danica was sitting at the kitchen table when he came home, already working on something. A sketch of a proposed modification to her school's gymnasium ventilation, based on a problem she had noticed during PE class. She had labeled the components, in her careful, slightly too large handwriting, and added notes in the margins. He sat down across from her. She pushed the sketch toward him without looking up. "Tell me what's wrong with it," she said. He studied it. "Nothing's wrong with it," he said. "But if you moved this intake 6 inches north, you'd get better distribution in the corner by the bleachers." She made a note. He watched her work. Outside, the Winnipeg evening was doing the thing it does in June, holding the light longer than you expect. The sky staying blue past 9 o'clock, the neighborhood quiet, except for the sound of someone's lawnmower 3 houses down, and a dog somewhere that had something to say about it. It was not a perfect life. It had gaps in it the shape of Colette, and it probably always would. There were still months that were financially tight, and a school trip in the fall that required some creative accounting. A truck that needed more attention than he had time to give it. But there was soup on the stove and a child at the table who wanted to know how the world worked, and he was home before it got dark, and for the first time, in a very long time, he felt like that was not something he had managed to achieve despite everything. It was simply where he was. Here is a question worth sitting with. How many people do you know who have been carrying something heavy and quietly, at work, at home, in between, without ever asking anyone to notice? Because those people are everywhere. And most of them are not waiting for rescue. They are waiting for someone to finally say, "What you've been doing has mattered, and you don't have to keep paying for it with everything else." That's a thing we can all do. It doesn't require a letter on hospital stationery. It just requires paying attention. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who deserves to hear it. And subscribe to Integrity Tales. Because the stories worth telling are almost always the ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in rooms nobody else is watching.